but I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. My name is Cassandra Brown, and I am the program manager at the Ohio State Offer Program. Welcome to those of you who are joining us live, and to those of you who may be watching the recording from our website. So just quick reminder to please keep your sound off, and I will probably just go through here and mute people before Larry gets started. If you do have a question during the presentation, if there's kind of a pause, you're welcome to unmute and ask, or you can kind of use the little chat function, which should be around the bottom of your screen usually. It's like a little conversation bubble. If you're not familiar with Zoom, you can look at that and type your question in there, and I will be watching that, and we'll make sure that it gets presented and answered to the best of our ability. So, and I'm sure we'll take some time at the end for some questions too. So very happy today to have with us a pioneer of agro ecosystems at Ohio State. That's Dr. Larry Phelan. And he is going to share with us about some of his work on post-industrial urban soils in the Cleveland area. So looking forward to that, and I will go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Cassandra. Welcome everybody, and thanks for being here this morning. I wanted to share with you some of the work that we've been doing up in Cleveland. As many of you know, the interest in in urban farming has been growing, and although the attention on this matter has been increasing and the awareness has been increasing, this issue or this area is actually not a new idea, and actually has a very old history, and as we'll see in a moment here as we go through. And I thought what I'd do today is not just focus on the research we've been doing, which of course I'll talk about some of that, but I thought it'd also be interesting to look at some of the broader issues and some of the history of urban farming in Cleveland as well. In 2010, there was an article written by the magazine Travel and Leisure talking about the 20 most visionary cities in the world. And these were cities like Abu Dhabi, Paris, France, Amsterdam, and other cities like that. For various reasons, Seoul, South Korea, and I'm sure you'll be maybe as shocked as I was to find that number 4 on this list was Cleveland, Ohio. And what qualified Cleveland for this list was their work on urban farming. And so this I found to be very interesting, and what they highlighted in this article is actually the fact that the Galleria Mall in downtown Cleveland had been converted from a mall to actually a greenhouse where plants were being grown, tomatoes were being grown. And so this was considered very, of course, innovative. It's no longer a greenhouse and is kind of being converted back to business space and such. But so maybe they chose Cleveland as an innovator of urban farming for the wrong reason, but nevertheless, I think it does qualify, because when we look at the history of urban farming, there are a number of things to point to as an innovator. And actually, if you look on the web, there are a number of other articles that also list Cleveland as one of the innovators. One of the points of time that we can look to is right around 2008, 2010, around that time, where we saw this report that was done called Reimagining Cleveland, a More Sustainable Cleveland. And this was work that was a collaboration between the City Planning Commission and the Cleveland Land Lab at Kent State University. And this project had the premise that was, given the large and growing inventory of vacant properties in the city of Cleveland, it is unlikely that all of the city's surplus land will be reused for conventional real estate development in the foreseeable future. So the question was, what is the city going to do with this land? And so they identified three main strategies for reuse of the land. First was neighborhood restabilization. So this would be re-infill of properties that had been houses and such that had been demolished, green infrastructure, and productive landscapes. And so they identified certain areas that could be used for production of food and also production of energy. And so specifically, this was in the plan to utilize some of this land for this purpose. They also identified three main goals in this reuse plan: the productive use of the land and for a public benefit, ecosystem function, so the restoration of ecosystem services, and the remediation of the damaged soils. And so concurrent with this report, and again about this time, we saw this flurry of laws and policies by the city of Cleveland related to urban farming that occurred. And so we see the production or the creation of an urban garden or an urban farm district in 2007. And this set up a zoning category for urban gardens such that once this zoning had been assigned and that area had wanted to be, or there was a proposal to use it for something other than gardening or farming, a public hearing had to be proposed, and the plans had to be reviewed. There was also a grants program set up where up to $5,000 for was given to various urban agricultural organizations and co-ops and CSAs for growing produce. There was a revised zoning for small livestock, including bees, keeping bees in the city. There was a change in the lease policy for the Cleveland Land Bank. And you can see there are a couple other changes in zoning regulations and access to water that occurred during this time. And so you can see that the city was all on board as far as supporting urban agriculture. But this policy or this support for urban agriculture and farming in the city actually goes back much further than this time. And when you go back to the history, we find that actually farming was very much a part of the curriculum of the school system going back as far as 1904. So in 1904, the Cleveland Public School System created the first school garden program in the United States. And this was not just a small program. They actually developed this program, and it spread throughout the school system in Cleveland, and it continued until 1978. And so these are some excerpts that I found in a report from the and you can see here they actually had a horticultural division. They had a Department of Horticulture in the city schools, and they had teachers that were horticultural teachers. And in this report, you can see down here, this is a great quote that I loved. It said, "To allow a child to grow up without planting a seed or rearing a plant is a crime against civilized society." and our armies of tramps and hordes of hoodlums are among the just fruits of our educational system that slights this most important matter. So you can see that they were very passionate about this matter too. And so this was no small deal for them. And so what they did in this was to set up a series of what they call garden tracks. Some of these tracks were at the schools themselves, and some of them they were actually set up in housing neighborhoods. And so you can see that this is a map of these garden tracks that were set up across the city and their locations. And these, you can see down here, serviced 103 schools. So this is, again, widespread across the city and involved all of the schools in the school system. And in total, there's about 40 acres of garden land and farming land that was involved. And again, as an example of how serious they were about it, and one of the oldest garden tracts they set up, when they built a new school, which was the Benjamin Franklin Elementary School, they bought 11 acres, 5.5 acres went to the school, 5.5 acres went to the garden. So this was very much integral to their curriculum at that time. Oops. So here's some pictures from that are archived in this library that are really pretty cool that I found, showing some examples of students that are involved in this horticultural program. This is actually at the Benjamin Franklin Elementary School. And you can see, again, some of these were located at the school and some of them were in the housing tracts themselves. This is another one. This is at the Willard School. I love this picture here. This kid is really rocking this look here. I'm guessing this is a kid you wouldn't want to mess with. These were in the before 1930, most of those pictures were taken. But you can see these involved kids of all ages. Some of these are more high school kids. These were taken during the 50s and 60s. They received training even in how to safely carry the implements, how to carry the rake and such. And the other thing that I found interesting, this is an excerpt from a teaching manual, and this went not just during the school year, but it went throughout the summer. And so teachers were expected to continue to grade the students throughout the summer. So here you can see an excerpt from this training manual. It says, "You are one of more than 100 teachers appointed to make more than 15,000 visits to Cleveland homes this summer." So again, this is an indication of how widespread this program was. And so it gives instructions in terms of how many visits you were expected to do a day, how to grade them, and how to encourage them and such. So again, a very broadly what do I want to say, integrated program into the curriculum of the school. And it was very unfortunate. I think that this ended in 1978, and there was really, due to the lack of funding, and the people involved obviously were very upset, and they wrote letters to the governor trying to reverse it, but they were unable to. So a lot of these these gardens were plowed over and set to turf or parking lots, but some of these actually still exist today. So again, this Benjamin Franklin, which is the oldest one, still exists. This is one that kind of makes us think of the old Joni Mitchell song of putting up a parking lot. They tried to, in 1978, they tried to pave this over and put up a parking lot, but the neighbors were able to save it. And so this is now a community garden. So this has been farmed continuously for almost 100 years now. And it's still the same size as it was when it was first established. And again, here are a couple others. These are right by the schools and are as they were when they were established as well.
Larry, are these still run by the schools?
No, they are run by the communities. So this is run by a community organization, the Benjamin Franklin Community Gardens. This one is the Kentucky. This one is in Old Brooklyn. This is the Kentucky Garden. This one is Miles Standish Garden by the Michael Smith Elementary School.
So when these were part of a school, that was part of the students' curriculum, so it wasn't like something voluntary. Every student had to get involved with it, right?
That's my understanding. Yeah, that they were it was part of the curriculum. Now I think on some of these summer programs were, it sounds like there was volunteer involvement there. And then there was also, you could be involved in a fair. And so that was more voluntary too. But a lot of, when I saw some of the numbers, I mean, there were thousands of kids that were involved in the fair entries. Still a lot of involvement. So, I mean, I was shocked when I learned about this, you know, that who would have thought that this was going on in Cleveland? And it was so widespread. So that's one legacy that maybe we're not familiar with. This is the legacy of Cleveland that we're much more familiar with. And that's, of course, the legacy of heavy industry in Cleveland. These are some pictures of industry at its heyday, if you will, in the 50s in the Cuyahoga River, of smelting of metals. And of course, in Cleveland, there's a lot of smelting of steel and such, but also, again, something I wasn't aware of was there's a lot of smelting of lead. And so there was a number of locations where they were specifically smelting lead. And so it's not surprising that as a result, we have a lot of, that's probably our biggest contaminant that we see in Cleveland now in the soils. So unfortunately, as we know, a lot of this heavy industry then left, and with it left the population. So in the 1920s, actually, maybe something you also don't know is Cleveland was the 5th largest city in the United States. And after 1950, then that's when we started to see these precipitous declines in population in Cleveland. And this is true actually of a number of cities, primarily in the Rust Belt of the United States. So that this is some examples of cities in the Rust Belt that have lost more than 50% of their population during this time period since 1950. The other period of population loss that I want to highlight is right here in the early 2000s, and this is related to the mortgage crisis when housing prices got inverted, and so a lot of people walked away from their homes and also industrial properties. People actually owed more on their properties than the properties were worth, and so they just abandoned them. And so now the city then took over these properties, and that's where we we come up. You know, we see situations like this where people were just really desperate to get out from under these incredible debts that they were experiencing. And so, like I say, the city then took over these properties, and we see the demolition of a lot of the homes. And as you can see here, and then what's left behind then is a vacant lot. In some cases, it's just an individual vacant lot. In other cases, you can see big areas that are completely vacated. And Yeah, and so you end up with this kind of patchwork of areas across the city. As of now, I think the latest count that I've seen is like 27,000 vacant lots across the city of Cleveland, and this amounts to about 16 square kilometers, or about 7% of the land area of Cleveland is now vacant lots. You can also see that it's not uniformly distributed across Cleveland, but there's a concentration of vacated land, and particularly in the poor areas of Cleveland, particularly in Glenville and the Huff neighborhood and the east side of Cleveland is where things are worse in this regard. So again, back to the idea, now we have the cities seeing this both as a problem, but also an opportunity. So what do we do with all this land? And as I indicated before, the city saw the possibility of using this for urban farming, this land. So how about some of the social drivers of urban farming in Cleveland? And one of the big things is in that report was the idea of improving the environmental sustainability of Cleveland, and this idea, this concept of Cleveland making it a green city on a blue lake is something that's driving the decision making as far as how land will be reused. But the other area is, of course, the issue of food insecurity and food injustice in Cleveland. And here are three factoids, if you will, that kind of highlight this issue. First being that African Americans make up 30% of Cuyahoga County, but 79% are more likely to die from diabetes than are whites. 1 in 3, or 400,000 people, live in a food desert, which are defined as high rates of poverty and no supermarket within a half a mile. In East Cleveland, Huff, and Glenville neighborhoods, more than half of the people rely on gas stations, mini marts, and fast food outlets to eat. And then finally, not a single Cuyahoga County supermarket, which is a supermarket or a store greater than 10,000 square feet, is owned by an African American. So this is a possibility that can be to some degree addressed by urban farming, if people can grow their own food and fresh produce as a healthier source of food for their families. But of course, urban farming represents some specific challenges that that you don't face in the rural setting. Particularly in these former industrial cities, and these include heavy metal contamination, contamination of soil by petrochemicals, and then also compaction of the soils. So in this project then, and by the way, this project was funded by USDA, and is a project that was a collaboration between Mary Gardner and myself, and Mary Gardner, who spoke to this group earlier in the year, has been working in urban farming for a number of years, and her work is more above ground and more landscape level work. And I thought it'd be really interesting if we could join forces and look at combining our below ground work with her above ground work that her lab is doing above ground, and synergize our activities. And so that's kind of the rationale behind this project. And so this project is a collaboration between her lab and mine, but basically it has two simple questions behind it. So first of all, are urban soils healthy enough for farming, urban farming? And then finally, can organic soil management improve the function of soils in the urban setting? So we had two study objectives. One, we wanted to track the legacy effects of this history of urbanization and industrialization on parameters of soil health. And then 2, determine whether the adoption of organic soil management could restore some soil ecosystem services. So to do this, what we did was to compare soils with different soil histories. So we chose 4 soil histories. So we sampled soils from the metro parks, which are located as kind of a ring around the city. And we sampled old fields such as this, and then also fields or areas that were wooded. We looked at vacant lots, urban farms, and rural organic farms. And the urban farms we looked at, first of all, used organic soil management methods. And also we only looked at farms where the management was in soils, no raised bed farms, because we're interested in the effects on the soils. The rationale here is what we're trying to do, again, this idea of tracing this trajectory of what's happening in the soil. So the metro parks kind of represent a proxy for pre-industrial Cleveland. So since they are kind of a ring around Cleveland, this was obviously we can't move the clock back. And so this is kind of our best guess for what the soils were like before Cleveland was actually established and what that soil ecosystem was like. So by comparing the vacant lot soils to these metro park soils, that gives us an idea of what degradation has taken place as a result of this history of industry and urbanization. And then by comparing them to the urban farm soils, we can get an idea of what those management impacts have been. And then by comparing the urban or rural organic farms, this gives us an idea of the effects of organic management on pre-industrial soils. So soils that had not had that history of industrialization and urbanization. And then by comparing the urban farm soils to the rural farm soils, we'll get an idea how well have these urban farm soils been improved? You know, are they just as good as the rural farm soils, or do we still have work to do, if you will? So these kind of represent the positive control. All right, so geographically, this is what we're dealing with. So we had about almost 100 sites that we were looking at. And like I say, the Metro Park soils kind of are spread out outside of the city primarily and represent kind of a ring. And this is why they call it the Emerald Necklace, this system of parks around Cleveland. And then our rural farm soils are even further out. And then when you look at the vacant lots, let's see if I can get this to work here. So if we zoom in on Cleveland itself, you can see, first of all, the vacant lots are these triangles here. So what we did was to contact a number of urban farms and mostly farms. And by the way, farms, gardens, primarily we're focusing on farms where they were selling their produce at a CSA or at a farmer's market or something like that. And then once we located a collaborator, then we would locate a neighboring vacant lot. The vacant lots were not difficult to find. There are so many of them. It really was the urban farms that were limiting. So we went to those first. All right, so the idea is to, we wanted to be able to match these up as closely as possible. And also what you see here are, these are former sites of lead smelting locations. And initially what we were trying to do was to look at the proximity of these to one of these sites. Got kind of complicated, so what we ended up doing was just calculating the geographical center of all of this industrial activity, and ended up being about right here, which was handy because this is the area they call the Industrial Valley. This is the Cuyahoga River, which is area actually where the Cuyahoga River caught on fire. So this is really the center of all the industrial activity anyway. And so we ended up, as we'll see later when we look at distance. We're looking at distance away from the center of industrial activity. When I say that, I'm talking about distance away from this point here. All right, so looking at gardens and farms around the city, this is just kind of give you an example of the diversity of farms that we see around the city here. This is Bay Branch Farm and Lakewood. This is one in Shaker Heights. This is the Ohio City Farm, a 6-acre farm, one of the largest urban farms, contiguous urban farms in the United States. Really neat place. This is a learning farm that was managed by Cleveland Botanical Gardens. And I won't get into it today, but really neat program that unfortunately has shut down just within the last couple years. That has been going on for about 25 years. A really sad story there, because really neat training program for young people. But anyway, this kind of gives you an idea of what we're dealing with here. All right, so soil health, of course, is made up of 3 primary sets of parameters: the physical, chemical, and biological. For physical parameters, we looked at soil texture, water holding capacity, bulk density, organic matter. Oops. Chemical, we did mineral analysis, heavy metal analysis, XRF and Mehlich 3. XRF measures, oops, I don't know why it's jumping on me. XRF gives you total levels, and then Mehlich 3 measures what's available. So this gives you bioavailable levels of heavy metals. And then organic contaminants, we measured our polyaromatic hydrocarbons and heterocyclic aromatic compounds. These are compounds that are associated with combustion, such as what would be coming out of smokestacks and also out of combustion from engines and traffic. And in biological components, we looked at soil invertebrates, the microbial community, using 2 methods. One that's called phospholipid fatty acid analysis, another one called RNA amplicon sequencing. And then we also did some plant and insect bioassays. So you can see we took a very holistic approach to trying to analyze these as broadly as we could. This is Youngnan Kim. He is the head researcher, really did the lion's share of all the work on this project. And this is just showing an example of what we did at each site for sampling here. So first of all, we just took a series of 1-inch cores for our elemental and heavy metal analysis. We then took a large core that we put into a Berlese funnel to extract invertebrates from the soil. Then we took a large soil sample that we used for other analyses and also for our insect and plant bioassays. All right, so what are some of the results we got? First of all, from the physical, here's what we found. So as far as pH, you can see that the pH was similar between the urban farms and vacant lots. Now, organic matter, here's where we start to see some differences. The urban farms were quite a bit higher than what we're seeing in the vacant lots, and even quite a bit higher than what was found in the rural farms. And so this is where the urban farms were really standing out. And not surprising, moisture retention also was highest in the urban farms and similar to the wooded areas of the metro parks, and quite a bit better than the vacant lots. Sand, this is of course something that has nothing to do with management, it was just as a fact of location. And so not surprisingly, these are very similar between the urban farms and the vacant lots. Same thing with silt and clay. All right. So on the chemical level, this is where we might expect to see some differences. And lo and behold, yes, indeed, when we looked at the organic contaminants, we saw that only the vacant lots were high in these organic contaminants. So you can see that the urban farming actually reduced the levels of these organic contaminants down to the level of what we were seeing in the natural areas, the areas that had never been exposed to these organic contaminants. And then looking at some of the heavy metals, same thing for lead. So we're seeing significant reductions in the lead levels, although we see a wide range, and we'll get back to this in a moment. But overall, we saw that lead levels were significantly reduced in the urban farms compared to the vacant lots. Okay, and this is, again, total lead, and then this is the bioavailable lead, but the bioavailable lead showed the same pattern. Arsenic is not really a problem in Cleveland, but that also showed the same pattern. We saw significant reductions in arsenic. Barium showed a little bit more confusing pattern, but nevertheless, it was also lower in urban farms than it was in the vacant lots. And then finally, nickel was also significantly lower than the vacant lots. And so again, to remind you, these urban farms were vacant lots that had been converted to the urban farms, but just simply managed by the addition of organic matter to varying degrees and tilled and whatnot. Okay, how about nutrients then? So when we looked at nutrients, here we see that the all of the soils were higher in ammonia other than the vacant lots. Nitrate levels were higher in the two farm soils compared to all the other soils. Phosphorus was highest in the urban farm soils. Potassium was also highest in the urban farm soils, as was calcium and magnesium. So you can see that the urban farm soils were performing pretty well. And they performed actually in a lot of these metrics as far as nutrients even better than their rural farm soils. And I think the reason for this was the fact that these farms are quite a bit smaller than what you're going to find in the rural setting. And so the addition of compost, we're seeing much higher levels of compost being added. And it's just not cost effective to add these levels of compost in these rural farms. So in terms of what this means or what looking at the relationships among all of these things that we're looking at, what does this mean overall? And so this is a method, without getting into the nitty-gritty of the statistics. What we see here, if we lump all this together, what this shows is this is a method that allows us to kind of look at the relationships among all of these different parameters. And if we look at all of the samples, what it shows is that there tends to be a relationship among all the heavy metals. And so in other words, when nickel is high, chromium tends to be high, et cetera. All right, and so they tend to cluster, all the heavy metals tend to cluster together, as do the organic contaminants tend to cluster with the heavy metals. And all the plant nutrients tend to cluster together as well, along with moisture. Now, when we look at the samples, when we look at the samples, then we can say, look at how similar they are to each other based on these characteristics of the levels of these different elements and metals and such. And what we can see here is that the metro parks are similar to each other, no surprise, and that the rural farm soils are pretty similar to these metro park soils. Now, when we look at the vacant lot soils, you can see there's a pretty dramatic shift in its chemical profile. And it is associated, if you look at its location, it's associated with higher levels of these heavy metals and organic contaminants. And so we refer to this as a trajectory of degradation. Now, when you look at the urban farm soils, now we can see there's a new shift. And this shift is associated with a reduction of heavy metals and a dramatic increase in the levels of plant nutrients. And so we're referring to this as a trajectory of remediation. And so you can see that it's not just a matter of returning back to this old location, but it's establishing a new trajectory, which is characterized by higher levels of nutrients, better moisture retention, lower bulk density, and lower levels of heavy metal contamination. All right, so I'm starting to run out of time, so I'm going to skip through some of this stuff. But one of the things we're interested in is also trying to figure out, okay, we see these differences. What's driving these differences? Can we figure out what's going on here? And so we can do this analysis we call pathway analysis. And it looks pretty complicated here, but what we're interested in trying to figure out is, for example, if we're interested in what's causing the reductions or associated with the reductions of heavy metals, can we look at the physical characteristics of the soil or the landscape level characteristics of the soil? Which of these are predicting the levels of lead? And so when we break this down so that we can eliminate, so we just look at those pathways that are significant, what we can see here when we look at all of the sites, we can see the distance away from that center of industrial activity is a major determinant. So what we see here is, first of all, if it's a dashed line, this indicates a negative effect. So in other words, the further we are from that area of industrial activity, the lower the levels of organic contaminants are, and the lower levels of lead, for example. Also, if it's a blue line, that means the relationship is very strong, higher than 0.5. And so on the landscape level, distance is the main factor that seems to be driving or predicting the levels of heavy metal and organic contaminants. All right. Now, when we look at just those samples that are in the city, so in other words, the urban farms and the vacant lots, we see kind of a different relationship here, because these sets of soils are all equidistant. There's no difference between these types of soils and the center of industrial activity. Now the landscape or the distance is no longer a factor. So now what we see is the biggest predictor of all the contamination is organic matter. And again, when you look at these, all the lines are dashed, which means that all of these relationships are negative. So organic matter, of all the physical parameters, organic matter is the biggest predictor of the reduction of heavy metals and organic contamination. So when we looked at this in a little bit more detail, what we found was if we look at organic matter levels and the vacant lots, we really don't see much of a relationship here between the two. However, if we look at the vacant lots, we see a very strong relationship. So in other words, as you increase the level of organic matter, which is a representation of how much organic matter the farmers are adding, we see this very dramatic reduction in the levels of lead that are found in the soil. You know, we can't say this is cause and effect just yet, but it's a very striking relationship. We see the same relationship when we look at other heavy metals as well. So it's very suggestive that that's what's driving this system here, or these reductions. It's also interesting when we look at nutrients. And again, for the sake of time, let's focus on the urban soils. Once again, organic matter is what's driving this increase in nutrients. So in here, the relationships are positive. They're strong and positive. And so organic matter is what's determining this rise in nutrients in these urban soils. All right, so let me give you one more set of data here, and this is looking at these phospholipid fatty acids that we use for characterizing the soil community. When we look at total phospholipid fatty acid, which is a measure of the total biomass of life in the soil, we can see that the highest biomass is found in the metroparks. And then when we look at gram-negative bacteria, we can see significantly higher levels in the urban farm soils relative to vacant lots, and not significantly different from the metro parks. Grassy, by the way, I didn't define this. These are the wooded lots. These are the old field or grassy fields. Similar pattern with regard to gram-positive bacteria. And in this one, I'm not really sure about as far as what it means biologically, but sulfur-reducing bacteria also show the same pattern, significantly higher in urban farm soils relative to vacant lots. Sulfur is also higher in urban farm soils. So that may be why we see higher levels of sulfur-reducing bacteria. Actinomycetes, this is significant. These were also higher in the urban farm soils. And actinomycetes are a very important ecological group. They play a number of important roles. They're important in terms of breakdown of organic matter in the soil, but also they live, many of them, these groups live in the rhizosphere, and they play a number of roles, such as inducing defensive pathways in the plants. They produce growth regulators in the plant. They can inhibit plant pathogens. They can increase phosphorus solubility for the roots. So they're really beneficial to the plant. So it's significant that those are higher in the urban farm soils. The only group that was not higher were the fungi. And you can see that these are lower in both of the farm soils. And this is probably a reflection of the tillage that occurs in farms and organic farms compared to the undisturbed soils of even vacant lot soils. All right, I'm going to, since I'm running out of time, I'm going to skip through this now and maybe just say one more thing, just because this is where we looked at the invertebrate community, and Kayla did so much work on this. I want to highlight what she did, but she identified over 5,000 individual invertebrates from all these soil samples we did, and these broke down into 4 main groups: the orobatids, which are called beetle mites, the formicidae, which are the ants, various other mites, and the columbella, which are the springtails. These is a little bit more complicated to figure out, but it was kind of surprising, because here what we found is most of these groups are actually higher in the vacant lots. And so, except for the columbella, they tend to be higher in the organic farms, both the urban farms and the rural farms. They're associated with moist organic matter soils, so that's not surprising. Same with these millipedes, tend to be in organic soils. Hemiptera are plant feeders, and so it's that's not a group that we particularly want to be higher in our farm soils. So I just want to, let me just wrap up there, make a couple conclusions. First, urban farming, say that urban farming has demonstrated that incorporating fresh organic matter can improve the health of urban soils by reducing contamination, increasing nutrient availability, reducing compaction and increasing water holding capacity. And I would say important here is not just for farming, but this suggests that possibly also just for general remediation of the soil and improvement of soil quality is a possibility. But I think the outstanding question, of course, is where are those heavy metals going? We need to understand the fate of those heavy metals before we make such a recommendation. I want to highlight all of our collaborators. These were all of our, we had a lot of collaborators, obviously, both in our urban farmers and our rural farmers. And of course, the Cleveland Metro Parks were great. There are a number of research collaborators, like two study collaborators that I mentioned before, Mary Gardner and Youngnan Kim. And Pat Lorch was awesome. He's the manager of field research, the Cleveland Metro Parks, and Kelly Barrett, who was the director of the Cleveland Botanical Gardens, the Green Core program that I mentioned that had the learning farms throughout Cleveland. So I'll stop there. Sorry, I went a little longer than I had hoped for, but if there's any time left, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
I'm going to throw this question from the chat at you just about, where do you have like some theories about where these heavy metals are going? Are they being taken up by the plants or?
Yeah, we're doing some further research where we, what I think is going on is it's known that heavy metals, particularly lead, chelates with organic matter. And it's usually talked about in terms of immobilization of lead. But what I think is probably going on is the lead may be chelating with dissolved organic matter, and that dissolved organic matter is actually moving through the soil column. And so it's actually moving deeper into the soil. And so that's why I say it's really important that we understand where it's going. So, if it's just going deeper into the soil, I think that's fine. But if it's now going into the aquifers or going into the, underground water supply, then that's a different issue. We've been running some experiments in the lab where we're setting up soil columns and then adding different types of organic matter to the soil, and then looking at the leachate. And we do find increased levels of lead in the leachate when we add organic matter to the soil columns.
Okay. Any chance that they're going into the plants? Is that an issue if people are selling these?
It's not really. Here's the deal. First of all, plants in general don't take up lead. Right, there's some specific plants called hyperaccumulators that are used for phytoremediation, but they're really specialized plants. Most plants cannot take up lead. And so there have been studies, measuring the levels of lead that are taken up, particularly something like tomatoes. They just do not take up lead. Now, where lead is a problem in farming is on the surface. So, when you're working with lead, or excuse me, working with the soil, and it's the dust that gets kicked up, and that either you breathe that in or you get it in your hands, and then somehow that gets into your mouth. That's a real danger. Or also if you have fairly high contamination, and under those circumstances, I guess I would not be inclined to grow root crops until you're able to reduce those levels to a safe degree. Because and again, it would be more because of the surface contamination of the root crop.
Another question here from the chat. What efforts are being made to reduce compaction as the vacant lots are reclaimed? For example, the old White Motors facility and the Ford complex at Brook Park.
I don't know the specifics about that, but it is a problem. And I can tell you that I broke a lot of tools trying to collect our soil samples from the vacant lots. It's really hard stuff. And it was amazing. On some of these learning farms, I would take the kids that were on these learning farms and show them, what they were doing, how they were improving the soils, just by, I mean, you would take the soils from these learning farms, you could reach your arm into these. You go across the street, and I'm pounding, I was breaking hammers trying to collect the soils from those sites.
Probably just adding organic matter would help by itself.
Exactly right.
Yeah, Amalee's also suggested, cover crops, especially daikon radish. So,
yep.
All right. Any other questions from folks? You can type it into the chat or go ahead and unmute yourself and ask. I know we're kind of out of time here, but if you're willing to stick around. No? Future work for this? Is this project going to go forward for a little while longer? You mentioned
a little bit longer. We just got a no cost extension last year. Of course, with COVID, was basically a lost year. We were not able to not only do any work in the lab, we were not allowed to go to the field. We were not even allowed to access the funds for the project. So the USDA did grant us another year to work on this. So I'm hoping, first of all, to continue some of these studies, particularly we have some studies planned to look at how the lead is impacting the plant and particularly how it's impacting insects that are feeding on the plant. So we had, this is a study we started where we found that, this was kind of neat here that I didn't get to, but we were contaminating soils with lead. And what this is the weight of a beet armyworm that's feeding on tomato. And we found that as you increase the lead levels, beet armyworm growth was enhanced on the tomato. So it appeared that the tomato was less able to defend itself. However, if the plant was fertilized with a compost as opposed to synthetic fertilizer, chemical fertilizer, the beet armyworm didn't grow as well. So it appeared that the compost actually was buffering that stress effect on the plant. And so we want to look at those mechanisms a little bit more fully to see what's going on there.
Michelle wants to know, are you aware of any other research using bacteria and microorganisms to remove heavy metal from soils? Mine reclamation or something?
No, because I mean, the real challenge, of course, is when we're talking about organic contaminants, that's relatively easy, right? You can get microbes that can break down organic contaminants. But heavy metals are, they're elements, you can't break them down. And so you've got to follow them. You've got to figure out where they're going. Now there's been a lot of work to try to make them unavailable. So like when I talked about total versus bioavailable. So there's some work trying to change the species of lead and particularly with phosphorus. And so you can create a species of lead that you can actually eat this stuff and has no impact on you. It just goes right through your system. And so that's been a strategy that people are looking at, so that you're not actually removing it from the soil, you're just making it non-available. And Nick Basta and Natural Resources has been doing a lot of work on that. But as far as microbial work, I'm not aware of a lot being done on that. Again, because, what are they going to do with it? Yeah.
I'm going to put in the chat the DIRT lab, that's Nick Basta's lab. If you are a homeowner and you're worried about lead and other heavy metals and contaminants, they do some testing for that commercially. So if that's of interest to anyone, I'm going to put that in there. And I'll do one more sweep for questions. Hearing none, we'll go ahead and call this done. Thank you very much to everyone who joined us today, and especially to Larry for a great, very interesting